read fiction. I was telling him earlier, most of what I read is nonfiction. This took me some places. It really did take me some places. I mean, I definitely can't stop thinking about it. I can't stop talking about it. So I'm gonna go ahead and, can I go ahead and start with my first question?
Yeah, please do.
And this is really posed to, we're gonna talk about policing. We're absolutely gonna talk about policing. I'm not gonna shy away from it, but I mean, the book packs so much in it, in relation to not just policing, but like the Black experience. And so my first question would be, having understood what, growing up Black in the South, specifically myself, what do you think Jason Mott's intention was by making so many references in the book to people being dark, and to use his wording, impossibly dark in the book? That really challenged me, possibly dark. I mean, because I knew what he meant, and I mean, it wasn't just one thing. It was like throughout, kept coming back to it. What do you think that was about, or what did that mean to you? Let's start off with too heavy a question. I do that sometimes. I mean, if for me, I'll start off for me. For me, and I was referring to this earlier, I do find it happens where we have been kind of, as African Americans, have been kind of taught that darker is worse, right? And that even does reflect, I believe, in policing and other things in America, right? If you look at the research actually says a lot of times, the lighter is better in terms of making money and some other things. What do you think his intention was in writing that book? Is just that's really my question.
Well, I guess for me is,
Actually, he's good. We can
Okay.
hear him. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So for me, I was going to say I have friends that are dark skinned and light skinned, and I noticed or have conversations, and I'm dark skinned, and Jason is dark skinned, and you cannot help but see the adverse effect that shades of color have on our community. Absolutely. And so I got friends who, and I will make the leap and say friends who are females who happen to be dark. And they sometimes have talked about how it has created, in my opinion, more of an internalized oppression of feeling inferior, especially in a culture that I'm gonna call white America, because it's typically deemed that if you are dark for some reason, that some sense of being stupid, being dumb, not being as bright as, and it correlates with what was called the bell curve. And it's been extremely impactful. And I believe Jason in the book wanted to stimulate dialogue, because that's not normally a conversation that I would have with friends who might of mine that might be white.
I want to talk so much, but I'm waiting. I completely agree with you. I think we don't talk about that, right? Like, that's not a conversation that people have, right? We talk about a lot of other things, which is why I was almost floored that he brought it up, but I love the fact that he brought it up. And I love the fact that he brought it up the way he did. He's just such a great writer, the way he did. So moving on to another part of the question, kind of connected. So and you brought up earlier, points in the book where, you know, kind of angling him as an author to write for white audiences, right? Making sure you write something that is going to make money. And usually when you say make money, that's writing for white audiences, right? How do you feel that is really viewed by America now? Do you feel like America acknowledges that? Or do you feel like that's something that we kind of act like isn't there? Like you have to, if you create, you have to create so that the white audience will appreciate it so that you can survive. I'm sorry, I feel like
those are some tough questions, Travis, and I'm a pretty smart person. So.
Well, I mean, I told you I read the book, and these are things I'll ask myself when I was writing the book, when I was reading the book.
I think it has to be, and it is extraordinarily compelling to all audiences. It's especially compelling, I would imagine, to people that walk in this country with African-American heritage.
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine. I mean, I don't have that heritage. I don't pretend to have that heritage, so I don't know from experience. I think that it is the kind of book that at this point in our history as a country, as a group of descendants of colonizers, as I am, this book is timed to address the current predicament that we find ourselves in as a country. And it positions the conversation into the lived experiences of people who look like y'all and not people who look like me. And I think that there's a lot of value in that. And I think that, I see this book as kind of a periscope. You know, when we hear news coverage of homicides of young Black men by police officers, we often hear about it from the distance of the media lens, right? So the camera, the storyline, the city is different. But what this book is, it's like a periscope behind that experience, underneath and through that experience. And from it, you come into the layers of traumatic dissociation, right? The disappearance, the invisibility, all of those things. And you come into it from behind the lens of colorism, which y'all talked about in the first question. And you come behind it from behind the lens of gender, because we are talking about men's experiences as well as some representations of women's experiences as well. And so I think this book has a compelling story, a very compelling and timely voice that we need to be hearing right now in our country. I think it is on par with the kind of writing that we heard from James Baldwin in the 1950s and 60s. I think it's on par with the kind of novel that we have from Maya Angelou and Toni Morrison. I think it's the kind of novel that really can sharpen our focus about why we need to make the social change we need to make. Does that make sense?
It does.
So behind the headlines, and I think the colorism in this is really, or the attention to skin tone in this, I think is really important, because oftentimes that attention to skin tone can be very dehumanizing. And what's underneath all of this is the utter humanity of the characters and the people involved in the story as it unfolds. Does that help?
Well, I guess for me, when we talk about colorism, of course, of lights. And if you look at my family, when we talk about dark complexion, on the light staying in the whole family. And when we go to reunions and we be standing there and we take pictures, everybody's dark skin. Always dark skin, although light skin than me.
Yeah.
And nobody's between users. When I stand out, I stand out. And I'm one that I read the book and I look at it and I say, hey, me,
Yeah.
or do I share the same thoughts as others? Look at the thoughts first. So it brought it, read it, I said that, and I was reading about it. Was that all? And what he was talking about, and I can feel it and I can relate to it. Because sometimes I sit there, and believe me, I was looking at my brother one day. This was a few years ago, and him and my nephew was sitting, and the room was dark, but we was on FaceTime.
Right.
And I made the mistake of saying, well, it's so dark in there. Not knowing, I'm talking about the light.
Right.
But 2 hours later, it came back and it was like, why you calling us dark? I mean, we're adults. I mean, this was about 5-6 years ago.
Right.
And it upset him. He said, do you know how that made my son feel? I'm like, whoa.
Right. Just talking about the light.
I'm talking about the lighting, but it came back later on that he was being kicked at school about how dark he was. Right. And a month, 2 months ago, his mama said, yeah, my nephew name's Ethan, and he says, he tells me that, you wonder why he's so dark. That brings back, and when I was reading the book, and I'm thinking about son, and I'm thinking about my nephew, and I'm thinking about my brother, like, wow, I'm really talking. I think like that. Well, how do they look at me every day when we come?
You mean your family? Like,
I'm talking about my family now.
How do they look at you?
Yeah. Reading the book and him saying
those things.
Yeah, it made me wonder.
Right.
How do they see me, or do they think that I see them as
like that you think you're better than
them because
Absolutely.
you're light? And
Absolutely.
that this book is really bothered me.
I'm gonna pause you right there. If they're having a little bit of difficulty hearing because the AC's on, so
Okay.
I'm just going to, this microphone actually is long enough to pass.
Yeah, that really touched me when I read the book and I sat back and I think of some of the things, just not in the month with my family, but my whole family attend family reunions or gatherings and stuff like that. And they look at me and they have names of me too. And that's good. But they have names of me too.
Right.
And this book just brought all of that back.
It brought a lot of things back for me. And that's what I was saying earlier. Like even the bullying on the bus.
Yes.
I was talking about that. The book refers to the emotion. Like he has a way of bringing the emotion of it, like putting you back on the bus again in your mind that you're in third grade again, right? And I didn't mean to bring up that point, but it wasn't just one time we talked about skin color. It was almost a theme throughout the entire thing. We're talking about darkness and levels of darkness. So let me move further a little bit to another question. So as you read the book, obviously you can see the South in his writing, right? Cicadas, and all this other stuff that you can go outside and you can almost hear the book, the South in the book, right? How much do you think it influenced? Because obviously he's traveled. I'm sure he's traveled the country, in real life, which is from the interviews I've heard that laid out a lot of his experience, in terms of writing this book. How do you think? How much of the South do you see in terms of race, and like how much of that did you see in the book that race into not just the South, but the Black South in the book? And I'll condense it a little bit and give you kind of point to what I mean. Like certain things in the South we do or we experience as Black people, right? That I'm not going to say they don't experience in the North, but skin color is one piece of it, but it's almost like a culture, the remnants of Jim Crow, right? How much of that do you see in the book? And can you point to any specific things that you thought in the book that that's uniquely the South?
I have a particular passage that harkens to the generational trauma, and where on page 130 he starts talking about the fear. That's what the fear really came down to. And fear is capital F, so it's a proper noun. It's a thing in itself. He goes on, he said that's what all of the other fears are derived from for people of a certain skin color living in a certain place. But it wasn't just a fear, it was a truth proven time and time again for generations. And here I wrote in the margins on my copy of the book, a concept from criminology that comes from a scholar named Raymond Michalowski called analogous social injury. Lynching and police killing are linked through time. A truth passed down through both myth and mandate, from lip to legislation. Certain bodies don't belong to their inhabitants, never have, never will again. A persistent, inescapable, and horrific truth known by millions of unsettled bodies, the fear. It has always been there, but I could see it now. I could really recognize it. And once that happens, once you see it, you can't look away. You can't ever quiet it. Can't ever forget that you don't belong to yourself anymore, but to the hands, the fists, cuffs, and bullets of a stranger. You can never come back from that knowledge, not ever. At least not without a mild, prolonged psychotic break, not without going more than a little mad. And we don't know anybody like that, do we? That's where I saw that.
So, say something.
Oh, sorry.
I know. It's so heavy. And I mean, when you talk about, the instance of, let's talk about policing a little bit, and the fear, right? There was a lot of that throughout the book. Where do you feel like right now, where do you feel like America is? Because we've gone through George Floyd, right? No one's really talking about that as much as they were obviously in 2020. And this is what happened, right? I think it was 2015, we had, when was Trayvon Martin? I think it was about 2012. And then, so you have these instances and then things kind of, I won't say die out, but we don't talk about it as much. Now we're kind of getting into that with George Floyd, right? So do you think a change is happening? Because I think I've never seen what happened after George Floyd. I will say that. I didn't see it. I've never seen as many companies change, as many companies develop DEI programs, as many companies. I've never seen that. Right? But do you think that there is a change or has been a change because of lasting change, not just temporary?
I would say that's complicated. Because even with companies developing DEI programs, is it window dressing?
Yeah.
Or is it that people and companies' culture or behaviors have really changed? And it's kind of hard sometimes to determine whether that is the reality or not. So you almost got to act as if that it really is a cultural change. Because I have seen, like you said, people do more of a deep dive into that. And I know personally, it has caused me to use or become or try to communicate more effectively. I think prior to George Floyd, I was not as astute with communicating effectively with white people. really. I used to, my communication style at the time was almost communicating with white people or people who happen to be white. Almost like they should know that was an insult. So I was dealing with them like they knew what it felt like to be Black, versus recognizing that white people don't know what it's like to be Black and never will. So that I got to use shared experiences or object lessons to make it more clear. So that was one of the things that was one of the changes that it made in me. Right. I was having a conversation with a young lady who happened to be white. And she was, after her and I had a conversation, when we came back a week or two later, she said, you know, Frankie, me and my husband was talking today before I left the house. And, you know, in the midst of COVID, she said we had to do a lot of things to prepare to be safe once they left the house. And she said, so after talking to you, I kind of felt like, were you trying to say that this is the type of preparations Black people have to do every day before they leave the house? I said, exactly. She said, that's exhausting. So I was able to communicate more effectively than just kind of, but they ought to know that was an insult.
I don't know about these politically correct when I say these thoughts here. And of course, we talk about more or less policing, whether we're changing in the police world.
Right.
Me personally, it's still a work in progress. A lot of work to be done. I think that learning the culture and making sure that our law enforcement community definitely learning the culture is very important to the change, because we don't understand how Black people are and how we can police them. And when I say that, I say that because when we come in law enforcement back in the day, they teach you to be one way. They teach you that the major thing that needs to be done is taking folks to jail. And most of the time we're in Black communities. We're not giving second chances or teaching them the right way to do things or go about, because that's not what we was taught. Now, as my career progressed, we had to learn to teach those things. It's more to be done. I don't know, maybe not in my lifetime we'll get there, but as long as it keeps going and the learning keeps coming upon us, we'll get to a place that, and I hate to say, it'll be tolerable. I don't know it'd be perfect.
Right.
Because the world is not perfect. And when we talk about policing and cultural change, as a community, we got to culturalize ourselves also. And that's when we talk about, we bring the chance to putting everything on law enforcement. Everything can be put on law enforcement.
Right.
They can make the changes, but people are not going to believe in changes. People are not going to share that narrative without the community. How are we going to change? We can train our officers to culturalize themselves with the Black community, but who's giving the culturalization of our law enforcement community to our Black community? That narrative has to change in order for these things to work too.
Yeah. Now, go ahead.
I have a couple of things to say about this.
I think George Floyd was definitely a pivot point in our history around awareness for a lot of our communities. And it was definitely a gruesome display of the tragic collision of policing in communities of color. The social response to that has been intense. It's been fiery. It's landed here in our city again. Well, it never really left, but that's a different story for another day. That's a different book. Maybe I'll write it. I mean, there have been plenty of, anyway, whatever. So what I want to say is that while the intensity of that response looks from the surface to be not quite as high-pitched, the communities that I'm involved in, that I see on a regular basis, are still responding, but they're doing it internally more than externally, right? So at UNCW, we're having a lot of internal conversations about historical racism in 1898 and the legacy of enslavement and a variety of different things related to how to make changes and how to document and change the situation. In other parts of our community, we're also having conversations throughout many nonprofit sectors and other community agencies that are also taking the lessons of the George Floyd tragedy into consideration for ways in which to do a better job in our community. For example, at LINC, the fire station, which will become a boarding house for young men of color as a safe place to live in our community, is an example of that. Sokoto House on Castle Street has a comprehensive community violence prevention program, which is, I think, probably among the best thought out, most comprehensive, which is why it's called comprehensive, strategies that I've seen in this city and in this country. So I think it really can become a national model, and it's based on a model from another city and modified and adapted for our city. So, you know, I think that we have, and I know that there's other work going on in the county. We have new people in positions of visibility to create change and to create dialogue and to create community and enrich community and create belonging, which is ultimately the goal of a DEI, is to create a sense of belonging, that we all belong together. We're all here. So I think that we have more things going on to consistently and continually address the power dynamics that we know resulted in the catastrophe of George Floyd's murder here in our own city, so that we can be better as a community and that we can all belong to each other and with each other. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Oh, sorry.
I really am thinking about, I'm going back to your comment earlier, and it had me thinking, I've spoken with officers before. I know you, right? So, I mean, I've seen you in action, right? And I know you cared about the community when you were, well, you're still in service, but when you were in, you know, before you retired, I've seen it, right? It makes me wonder that if, and I know officers that have talked to me about, they know there are things that aren't right. Like they know, you know, there's over policing in certain areas, no questions that people may not have asked someone who was white. They know that. I've spoken with them about it. As an officer like that, right, that is aware of that, talk about a little bit the pressure. Maybe you felt it, but the pressure that someone might feel as an officer that sees that, but still has to follow what you said earlier, you know, what you've been taught or what you've been trained. Can you speak to that, or is that too tough?
I don't know if it's pressure of seeing, without a specific example, when we talk about over-policing,
Mhm.
what do we mean by over-policing a community? Because it's different from my view when we talk about over-policing a community. Because if we're looking at it from the outside, not knowing the factors of why there's a lot of officers in this area, then it would look like over-policing. But if we get the data to show that the majority of the people in the Black community want law enforcement there because of the negativity that is shown on their community. And they praise officers being there, no matter how many you may see, because we call them and most of the time they're not coming. So I need to see that they're here. So that's not over policing to the ones that are being victimized in society.
Right.
It's over policing to an average person that rides by and
Looking at it from the outside.
seeing 13 officers standing on one block. Because the people that lives in that area want 13 officers there because it keeps 13, 20 criminals off the street. So it's hard to answer that question.
Yeah.
Especially that over policing question, because you can look at it.
Different way.
Yeah, and you can look at it from being in the Black community, and you can look at it from the law enforcement community.
And really my point was the pressure of the officer to feeling the pressure of having to observe it, you know, just from having to make a decision where you know this kid, because you've done, I've seen you were good at what you did.
Thank you.
I've seen you do it.
Right.
You know this kid. You know this kid doesn't mean, you know, you have a relationship with this kid, right?
Mhm.
You do it. I've seen you. You do it differently than somebody else would have done.
And that's come with training, putting the right person in the right place to train young officers. This is the best tactic to treat any community, not just like any community. If you do it in one community, you do it in all communities. And that's what has to be done to change the mindset of our officers to think like that. And using discretion in law enforcement is what is most needed. Like if I can do something else to keep you from going to jail, but to keep you on the straight and narrow, then I'm gonna do it first. Because you can help some folks, you can't help everybody.
Right.
And you just gotta give everybody the opportunity. And they want the help, they'll stay out of the way.
Go ahead.
No, you do. You say what you're gonna say.
So, I think in training a community, training institutions and training a police force, when you look at the crime numbers, and when you look at the differences in a subgroup and that are also different ethnicities, the question should surface that we need to be educated on is, why do you see more adolescents' behavior being arrested in the inner city or with Black groups than you do with white groups? Because see, to me, that's the question. And I see, like you said, so with Hargrove, he understands that 9 times out of 10, that Blacks that might be deemed exercising crime, it's called risk seeking. It's adolescence behavior. You got me? In white community, it's the same thing, but the risk seeking looks different because their families can afford to send them on skiing trips, canoeing trips, jumping out of planes. It's soothing the same underlying premise, which is risk seeking, which is what adolescent boys gonna do no matter who you are. And so as a result, since we're not, most Black community is not in position to be the medication for the adolescent's behavior and the risk seeking, they end up doing crime. And that's a different step. They looking at risk. They seeking risk. And I think that those are things that back in the day, people, law enforcement used to say, oh, he's just being a boy, he's just being a teenager. And as a result, there was a lot of mercy and forgiveness based on understanding what that looks like.
Absolutely.
And so it's complicated. I'm gonna keep saying it. It's a little complicated, but when you really look at it, yeah, it's not that complicated. It's complicated, but if you really look at
If you
it,
really look at it,
you know,
if you take it apart before you put it back
because
together.
it has taken me, you know, in a family, you know, I got 2 boys. And yeah, man, it took me a lot to keep one of them. I tried to keep both of them, but one of them still ended up doing 11 years in federal prison. But my youngest son, yeah, man, I had to fight tooth and nail. And I had to submerge him in white middle class culture so that I could get some of the benefits of what white people can afford to keep him out of the prison system. I mean, I didn't want to do that because you put a young man in a vulnerable position to then say, yeah, man, well, white people are better than me.
See, I struggle.
Yeah, but I was going to say, when you really look at some of those minute pieces, yeah, it's you really have to really dig deep to really, you know, number one, learn to be more confident about it. But my son used to say, Dad, why I got to play soccer and be on the team with all the white folks? I say, one day you're gonna thank me. Because then experience was talking. Like my uncle used to tell me, boy, keep living. I said, but uncle, he said, keep living. So that's what I had to tell my son. I say, son, keep living. And there have been times he said, Dad, I'm so glad, you know, but if I was in a different tax bracket, then I wouldn't have had to rely on submersing him in a white culture so that I could take advantage of what some of the resources that they stole from me a long time ago. I know that, you know, because when you look at it, and this is the last thing I want to say on it. The other day, I was on North 4th Street, and white people were sunning, just having a good old time. And so for a minute, I closed my eyes and I say, prior to the 1898 riots, that was us. And I had to do that to keep or submerge some of the anger that I wanted to feel at that time. And so I had to close my eyes and just take myself back to when that was us. And I don't want to say that, I'm not don't mean to sound mean.
That's good, honest.
But that was what I had to do, man, because I was like, man, look at, man, they having a good time. I mean, it was real. Thank you for allowing me to share.
Thank you both for sharing. Thank you all for sharing. What I want to say is complicated, and I normally have 14 weeks to get through it, but I'm going to try to do it in less than that. So first of all, policing can never change the social conditions that create street crime. It just can't. And the conditions that generate and create street crime are income inequality, lack of economic opportunity, and a variety of other cultural problems that go unattended, such as poor healthcare or poor access to adequate healthcare, low access to voting rights or suppressed voting rights, right? All of the ways in which people in communities that are struggling through poverty, have a lot of barriers that they don't control, that residents in those communities don't control, and don't have access to the potential for a stable economic livelihood. I know that policing is hard work, and policing can't solve that problem alone, right? Policing will not change social inequality. We talk about over-policing in certain neighborhoods. What we're not talking about is under-policing in other neighborhoods or other sectors of our economy. When we think about street crime, we tend to think about street crime as like the worst crime that there is, because it's dramatic, because it gets a lot of news coverage, because it reinforces the propaganda of historical racism that is part of our system of understanding and system of knowledge. When we had that episode with those police officers in Wilmington in 2020 being caught on audio tape saying the most vile racist things, saying it was time for a race war and they were ready, that is part of a culture that has been brewing for 400 years. That is not going to be solved by adding more money to police departments or adding more money to nonprofit organizations. It's only going to be solved by really telling the truth of it and tackling it. The under-policing of white collar crime and corporate crime and political crime is actually part of what creates the social inequality and reinforces the social inequality that contributes to the conditions, what Sean Ginwright, a scholar, refers to as persistent traumatic stress environments. So we're not talking about post-traumatic stress, we're talking about persistent traumatic stress environments. And that's what is reflected in this book, is a persistent traumatic stress environment of historical racism and contemporary racism. When you think about the amount of harm done by white collar crime compared to street crime, we have approximately, in the United States, this is US, we have approximately 15 to 16 or 17,000 homicides in the United States every year. We have 5 times that many people die due to corporate violence every year, and we don't see an alarm about that on the evening news. That is an under-policed, under-prosecuted, under-attended problem. And the people who are most likely to be victims of that kind of corporate violence are the people who live in those communities that are also impacted by the persistent poverty and the persistent economic inequality and the historical racism that we're concerned about on the basis of reading this book. So I'm trying to condense it, but we really do have to talk about the big picture and take our lens, our periscope, a little bit further out from the individual experience and even the community level experience, and look at the broader trends of our economic structure. And that is not going to be solved by reshaping how we do policing. What will help to manage that is reshaping how we do our economic conditions.
I just got maybe 1 or 2 things to say on that. Will it be under policing, or what the media wants you to see? Because it might not be under policing. It's probably being dealt with time and time again, but if the media don't report it, then who knows about it? If whatever sells media, whatever sells the newspaper, that's what's being reported.
Yes, as a criminologist, we do track those digits, and we do know that the vast majority of the people who are incarcerated from street level crime versus white collar crime. Although there is a cohort of people in federal prisons who are there for racketeering and organized crime and white collar crime and that kind of thing. That definitely happens. It doesn't happen on the scale that responds to the level of harm that's caused by the different types of crime, if that makes sense. So the vast majority of people locked up in prison are people who are prosecuted on the basis of community-based crime, not corporate-based crime.
That's just the ones that's incarcerated.
Yeah, and the people who are incarcerated usually are people that have to depend on the system of representation for answering the charges that are brought against them. Yes,
Because
it's-
ones that are incarcerated.
Always
Thank you
goes
for
back to
closing that.
economics.
Thank you for closing that.
Economics.
That's
Always
exactly
goes back
right.
to economics. And I mean, I actually appreciate all three of you for kind of painting the picture. Because I have specific examples. I know people that have committed crimes with, I'm not gonna tell it business, don't worry about it. That committed crimes with, when they, now they're, professionals, but when they were younger, they weren't black, but the people they were with were black, right? And it was handled differently. And they'll admit it was handled differently, right? But both participated in the crime. This particular person now owns his own dentistry, dental practice, right? Not in one, but dental practice.
But everybody thinking like.
Right. No, not in practice, right? Not even in North Carolina. But the point being, he's doing one thing. He had the ability, right? His parents paid. He had the ability to use that, to leverage that, to move on and allow that risk-seeking behavior not to determine his entire life. Right? The other people with him were not as fortunate. So I guess my question is, when does economics, when do we balance, or is it, will it ever happen that economics and justice kind of can almost be in balance? That makes sense, where you don't have, like our children, let's talk about our kids. Your kids are older, my kids are still babies, right? I saw the face you made when you brought up my two sons, right? Your face was, was prayer. I'm praying for you. I saw your face, right? I don't want that to be the case with our children. Right? When you say I got two black boys, it's like automatic, right? Your heart starts beating fast, right? You just gave their demographic information. That's all. We know why it is. I'm not going to belabor the point of why that is, why we have those emotions. Do you ever see there being, because we've been talking about this for years, decades, centuries, do you see there being a way out of this beyond this, so that we, at least on a small scale, so we're not talking to our children? We have that momentum from George Floyd, right? We saw some certain things at least be implemented. I won't say change, but some efforts. What's the next phase of that? Like, what else is left to be done? Like, what are the holes that you see that we can still fill that might move the needle a little bit more, so that I don't see that face that you do? I asked some hard questions.
I
I'm being
don't
real.
know what
Okay?
holes to be filled, because we ain't filled the ones we got open yet. And that's what we're gonna have to do, trying to fill those holes. If we get to what we need.
Well, let me say this. When I say fill holes, I'll say now there's been efforts where people are putting money, right, towards trying to create improve Black economics, start businesses, more training. I'm seeing it, right? Not saying it's solving the problem, but that's really my point. What's the next? I'm seeing that happen, right? Grants out there that are specifically being written now to increase that, help that, improve those areas. What is the next phase after you talk about creating Black business, right? What's the next phase after you talk? What's the next level? Like, those are the holes I'm talking about.
I think one of the next holes is that as Blacks start creating or commerce in their communities, then white people have the intention to spend money with black folks. Because you'll never catch up. You'll never be equal if that don't happen. You know, I need about 70% of white folks to intentionally spend money with black people so that we can truly become equal. That's the only way we're going to become equal. I mean, and that's because when we were separate, some people will call that segregation. Yeah, black people weren't begging for the money because we spent and our dollars circulated in our own community. Like it did in Black Wall Street, Tulsa, Oklahoma, sometimes 36 times before it left that community. When that happens, you cannot help but be successful. Got it. So if right now, if I'm making $200-300 a week, I'm spending probably 98% of all my dollars with white folks. And so their money bags are gonna be huge. And if white folks did that same thing for black folks, then our money bags would be huge. And then when we sit at the table, we sit at the table as equals. That's what I think the next thing to do. And if I asked everybody in the audience how many black people that spend money with this week, they probably would say nobody.
So I'm going to add to that. I think that's absolutely spot on. And I also want to say that as a restorative justice practitioner and an advocate for historical reconciliation and racial healing, we need to tell the truth, right? And we started a more truthful conversation about the massacre and coup of 1898 than what had existed prior to the centennial, which was a race riot caused by African-American people. And so for the first 100 years after 1898, the dominant narrative was to blame Black people for the violence that occurred in 1898, which of course is a lie, right? And so what we do know, and based on some really good historical research, we know that in Wilmington, leading up to the massacre and coup of 1898, 56% of the population of Wilmington was African American, and it was a thriving middle class with entrepreneurs and skilled laborers and skilled workmen, and just a really great cultural scene among the Black community here in the area. We had Love and Charity Hall on 7th Street. We had I wasn't here, but the community Wilmington had a really thriving cultural life and a vibrant economic prospects for Black people who are just a generation and a half away from having been enslaved. And the amount of progress that was made in such a short period of time is really impressive and amazing. And to make that kind of progress is inspiring. So then it got cut off at the knees, and now we have a population of African American people in Wilmington that's about 13%. And we do have a lot of thriving business owners that need our business and need to succeed in this town, whether it's On Time restaurant on Castle Street, or whether it's Truck's Chicken, or whether it's Nippy's, or whether it's your local hairdresser. There's lots of ways in which our dollars can support entrepreneurial Black businesses, which we need to do. We also haven't really had a conversation about making up for the harm of 1898 and the plundered land, the plundered businesses, the stolen lives, the death and destruction, the fleeing away from Wilmington, what I call the Wilmington diaspora, and I'm not the only one who calls it that. The people who fled for their lives and left everything behind and weren't able to come back and get their livelihood or their businesses or their possessions or their homes or whatever it was that they had depended on for quality of life that they enjoyed here. So that has never been repaired. And so I think it's time for us as a city to have a conversation about reparations. And it's time. And I probably will get some blowback from that, and that's okay. Well, you know, you can't have reconciliation without truth-telling. And you can't have reconciliation without an effort to make amends. So I think it's time for us to have that conversation in the city.
Oh, oh, sir, you tell. Something to say on
Yeah, that's it.
that. Okay. You want to say?
I do. So we are headed, we need to start heading towards the question and answer portion. This has been a fantastic conversation, and I hate to see it kind of heading that direction. I do have a question online. So this person says that I have lived in ILM for 24 years and have watched our public schools become more and more segregated. How do you feel about this?
If
That is the
I'm
question.
asking the questions. I don't take questions.
I mean, that's complicated. And the reason that I'm expressing the complicity of that is who don't want to go to a school in their own neighborhood? Got me? So I want to go to a school in my own neighborhood, and I don't want to be told that if we integrate or if I'm bust or if I go to another school that I got to sit by white people to be real, because I don't. So that's when that gets complicated. I went to an all-black Christian school K through 8. And when I got to Roland Bryce and Hargett, when I left that school, I always scored in the classroom at the top because I went to a school that taught mastery. However, the teachers resented the fact that I was as smart as the white kid in the class. So it didn't, I didn't have to be, you know, and I didn't go to a school in my neighborhood because then they sent blacks to different schools to meet a quota that they needed for diversity. At least it's not like that anymore. But when I came along, you could have students in a neighborhood that went to 6 different elementary or middle schools just because of, you know, we shouldn't have neighborhood schools and black people needed to come here to meet a diversity quota. However, now that we do have a sense of neighborhood schools, we need the same great teachers. We need the same economic ability to make our schools great. And to justify that, Williston Senior High School that everybody talks about before we integrated and before that school was closed by the school board, it was ranked top 5 in the nation amongst all schools, black or white. But they still closed the school that turned out the best and the brightest of us. So, and that was a neighborhood school. So that's the argument that becomes where it becomes complicated, because it almost feels like when we have that conversation about neighborhood schools that, yeah, Frank, I need you to go sit by white people in order to for you to be great or be smart. And I just don't buy that. If I buy that, then I buy the bell curve, and I don't.
That's. Are you gonna say something?
No, you say.
All right. Can we switch seats now? I can be there. Because I love this question because I totally agree with you. Like I don't. I've asked this question. You drove right where I needed you to drive to. I've asked this question so many times to people who actually went to Williston. Right? You don't know how many times I've asked this question, and I'm not a genius, but I mean I can pick up things pretty quick. Every time I ask the question, I mean I see people that graduated from Williston and they're like CEOs of companies or retired CEOs, presidents of colleges, and all this stuff. And it just don't add up, right? Like, why? And I've even asked my parents, I've gone deep into this, right? I've asked my parents, I said, because they talk about their schools being closed. Like my dad was actually, he was, you know, he's old enough to have had, you know, an all-black school and have been moved. So we have to change the way we are, and I'm not talking specifically about neighborhood schools, I'm not talking, but I am talking about equal resources, equal teaching, having an equal impact, right? Nobody is really looking at what worked. One of my professors told me when I was working on my doctorate, she said, we always talk about the problem, but we never really look at the solution. So we always talk about the problem kids, the problem children, but there are some that are succeeding. We never go to look, we always look at the problem and try to find the answer, which doesn't make sense. Why wouldn't you go to the one succeeding and figure out what they're doing, what's different, right? And duplicate that. And so Williston to me was a great example of something that was working, right? I wasn't there, but from what I've read and what I've heard from the people that went there, it was working, you know, on some level it was working. Why aren't we going to look into that and find out why it worked, what was working? You know, ask the right questions, study it, right? And not just do this blanket response for the reason we need or don't need neighborhood schools. It's not about this. It's, if you're educated, there's something that had to happen for that education to happen, right? It's not just a school who just drove you to the building because you sat, like you said, sit beside somebody who's a different color than you, you got smarter. It doesn't work like that, right? So I think we need to start asking a different question and we need to start looking at different solutions. Go ahead.
I got the answer.
Go ahead.
And so where does that school exist today? It exists in,
There are lots of examples. Of
yeah. One is in Inglewood, Chicago, called Urban Prep Academy. In fact, a young man from here named Dennis Lacewell is one of the academic vice presidents of that school. They graduate, and it's a school for all Black males. They graduate 100% of the senior class every single year and have done it for the last 8 years. And they typically go to at least 50 to 60 different four-year universities. And again, the guy that can come do that here is from here. And that's where he is. So that's something. And so everybody look that up, Urban Prep Academy.
And Hanover Community Endowment. New Hanover Community Endowment has the funds to do a lot of things. So I think we all need to keep our eye on the endowment and the opportunity to influence how that money is allocated for the greater good of our community and to address many of these concerns that we have.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Are you listening, Mr. Buster?
I'm sorry, Davian might not be talking. So, and cut me off when it's time. But
we have about 10 minutes before we have to be out of the building. So,
okay.
Yeah.
So, you know, to go back, we're not asking those questions. You know, we're not asking those questions. We're not looking at that. We're looking at the other stuff, almost like it's a smoke screen. We really want kids to be educated, right? Let's look at how they can be educated rather than looking at all of those other things. Statistics are statistics, but if you look underneath the statistics, there's a reason that they are like that, rather than just looking at the top part, like the numbers show that they're at. You know, when you have students sitting beside someone, you know, numbers, well, why is that, right? Let's look at why and not necessarily think it's just because it's osmosis, right? You know what I mean?
So one of the things that I loved about this book, and it reminded me of when Soot was told that invisibility was his superpower.
Mm-hmm.
And it reminded me of a program that the Upperman African American and Cultural Center at UNCW had a theme a number of years ago with melanin as your superpower. And Sean Palmer, who's the director of the Upperman African American Center, I think is a brilliant organizer and a brilliant event planner and just an all-around terrific person. had this year-long series about melanin as your superpower, and it creates a different narrative rather than a narrative of depleted humanity due to colorism and historical racism. It was a narrative of vibrancy and joy and creativity and cultural expression and achievement and all kinds of wonderful programs that really helped to shape how the young people who were part of the Upper Mid-African American and Cultural Center, as well as our campus, could really see themselves as a contrast to the dominant narrative in our culture around historical racism and contemporary racism. So that's the kind of thing where I think creativity really is an avenue toward resilience and survival. Our culture, our dominant culture, which I would describe as a white supremacist culture, white patriarchal supremacist culture, has tried to eliminate and contain and oppress people of color and women for centuries. What we're seeing is that we still have the benefits of the creativity and the resilience and the innovation from within these communities who are still, if you've gone to the African American History Museum at the Smithsonian, the top floor is the celebrations of making a way out of no way. You know, people who are still striving and still trying to instill in their children through education and through achievement the value of being part of a community and being creative and being a writer or being a speaker or, you know, being a poet. We have some really beautiful poets here in Wilmington who do an amazing job. Sokoto House hosts Speak Your Piece. There was just one, a celebration of James Baldwin's birthday earlier this month, where Letty Gore, who is a local James Baldwin expert and historian, spoke about the importance of James Baldwin's writing even to today, even though he was writing in the 50s and 60s, right? So we have some really talented, beautiful, smart, energetic, and brilliant people in this town who are our treasures. And we need more of that to be featured.
With that, we'll take one more comment and then we have to wrap it up. So
Did anybody in the audience have a question?
does anybody here have a question or comment?
I had go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, if that worked, that school, if it's working somewhere else,
Yes, sir.
we have Glow Academy here for our
That's right.
That's right.
female audience.
Yes, that's right.
But we seem to forget about our young African American males. If that's working, why are we not
That's right.
doing it? Or going and asking for the fund?
One of the things with Young Mogul Development Group that I do that I think is very important is making sure you enter a room and understand, almost like you said, your black is your superpower. You don't bow your head when you come in the room, right? That's not what you do. Like there has been, especially no matter who's in the room, you know, if you come in certain rooms and you won't bow your head in other rooms, if it's white dominant, you may feel like, you know, inadequate. And that's one of the things that I feel like for me, my dad, I didn't realize it was a thing he gave me. I didn't realize that until I got older and saw how I used it. And I realized, you know, other people, you know, when I saw that and other people, no, don't do that. Don't walk in a room and feel like that, right? And so I think that's something else that we teach. A lot of times I feel like for boys, black boys, we almost feel afraid to empower them in posture. It's almost like once we empower them in posture, it's almost like they become a threat, right? And so it's just like you can walk with your head up, I should be able to walk with my head up as well. And I think we need to do a better job in our community of being okay with black boys being out front and being proud, and being able to speak, and being okay with speaking and speaking the way they want to speak, right? And so I'm not going to talk too much, but I feel like that's really important and needs to be said, because there is something to be said for, you know, bowing my head when certain people come in the room. I don't know, no. We don't need to teach that. We need to find ways to change that shit.
So
And
last
with-
week, we had the conversation about trauma and generational trauma. The opposite of trauma is not only healing. The opposite of trauma is empowerment. And what you just said is about the empowerment of people who are living with the legacy of historical trauma. That's all I'm going to say.
All right, well, and with that, unfortunately, we do have to end this. This has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you all so much for being here this evening. The recording will be out in the next couple of days. Thank you all again. I really appreciate you being here. This is wonderful. Thank you.
Great job, team.